Hi everybody, it's Dr. D, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about assessment-driven instruction. I want to thank you all for leaving comments on my first video on packing the CAL TPA, and I've seen a lot of questions about assessment and asking me to really talk a little bit more about different kinds of assessment measures and what you should consider for submitting. So let's get started. In CAL TPA Cycle 1, it is all about assessment, baby. So just like Cycle 1, you're going to unpack your content standard, you're going to write a learning goal. In this cycle, you're actually going to plan a series of lessons. And those series of lessons are connected by assessment. Now, when you're in the classroom, you're constantly collecting assessment to help you connect with what you're teaching and what your students are actually retaining. It's kind of like this symbiotic relationship that goes back and forth with you and the kiddos. So, in this particular cycle, you are going to describe one of your informal assessments, student self-assessment, and formal assessments. Okay, that's three things that you're describing. You may have more than 3 assessment measures, and typically you can, even asking questions, that's a type of informal assessment. My exit ticket every day, that's a type of informal assessment. You will write a narrative about your assessment up to 5 pages, and you'll provide copies of the formal assessment. So if you have a curriculum program that you are using, that can be your formal assessment. You could just print it out, submit it. That's how you're measuring students' learning based on the curriculum that's provided. Of course, you can always make up your own formal assessment measure. I actually do that quite a lot in math. I have my students create projects or posters or presentations because I like to really connect all the different ways that student learns and incorporate multiple means of action and expression. So with those formal assessment measures, as you can see here, they want a rubric or a scoring criteria. So your scoring criteria, and might just be a list of things that they need to include in their project with points for every item on that list. Your rubric, I will show you an example here, will have your items similar to criteria with how they get points for each of those pieces of evidence that you're looking for. So this is for an equivalent ratio display. Students need to describe, they need to define ratios, and if they're doing above and beyond, they get exemplary. If they've demonstrated proficiency of each of those criteria, they get 2 points. And if they forgot it or they missed the mark, 1 point minimum effort. All right, so an example of a rubric, and we got to look at that. So the next piece is just unpacking a little bit about different types of assessment measures. Informal assessment can be those purposeful questions that you use, that you ask your students to check for understanding. I would be very explicit in your planning to really articulate those types of questions. That shows the reader that you've really thought about how questions can inform your instruction, how it provides you with evidence of learning, and how those questions are hopefully higher order thinking questions to really give you evidence or information about what your students understand in relation to a particular concept. So feel free to ask those questions. And one rule of thumb is if you write a question, it could be answered by yes or no. It's most likely not a higher order thinking question. Informal assessments are also going to provide us with in the moment feedback while we're teaching. Certainly, you want to include other types of informal assessment measures. You only have to describe one, but you may be using exit slips or do nows when they come in, a warm up, homework, student and group reflections, and student peer review and critiques. Student created representations. So let's say they're making the area model, they're drawing a representation, or they're showing you how they add and subtract integers using a number line. Those are all students' products of learning to say, are they really getting these strategies that I'm teaching them? That's your informal assessment. Student self-assessment is the students reflecting on or evaluating their own learning. So you could even take that rubric that I shared with you and share it with your students and have them give themselves a rating or a grade. So kind of doing two birds with one stone, because then you get to staple on your rubric. Students can also do, I always do like an index card and having students, use a Likert scale and rate their confidence about the particular skill that we're working on. How confident do you feel adding and subtracting integers on a scale of 1 through 5? 1 being not at all confident, and 5 being so confident I could teach this to somebody else. And then having them reflect, like, why do you feel that confident? What have you done? And that really ties into the whole phenomenon of growth mindset, because we want our students to attribute their hard work and effort in terms of their hard work effort pays off in their performance and their confidence. All right. Finally, formal assessment can take place in multiple ways. It could be the curriculum unit test or a comprehension check. It could also include any types of technology curriculum and technology assessment measures that you've been provided, that you can then, of course, share and submit using a rubric that will provide evidence of students' mastery of that content standard. So you want to make sure that is really hitting the mark. You're connecting that assessment measure to that rubric. And because later on, you're going to look at those pieces and say, what do I know based on these assessment measures that I've collected about how my students are able to multiply integers with fluency? All right. So, step 2, you will be teaching and you will be assessing. So, looking at that particular step, this is where you get to videotape yourself and annotate 4 video clips. Note that they're 5 minutes each. You want to go over that mark. All of the 4 clips are here. The first one is assessing student learning and development of academic language. This is a huge piece. Remember, you're being authorized to teach English language learners. You will receive your ELL authorization with your credential. So this aspect is really about how you can develop academic language. What are some ways that you're explicitly teaching academic language, and what are some ways that you're assessing student learning? Our second video clip should show evidence of students using educational technology. So again, if you have some programs that you're using at your school, maybe they're doing Splash Math or iReady, or you're using No Red Ink, how are you incorporating students using technology? And typically, the technology is also going to give you assessments. So after students have completed this quizzes, then they will see their level of mastery of a particular skill. And that would be a good piece to also include that self-assessment, because they'll know right away how they perform on a particular skill. And then you can just go right into that self-assessment. The third video clip is providing content-specific feedback to students. So in this segment, perhaps you're walking around the room, you're providing feedback to students, you're doing a student conference, you're asking questions, you're giving them insight into their performance or whatever standard you're focusing on and how they're doing. And then finally, your fourth video clip is going to be a video of you assessing student learning and using higher order thinking skills. So you want to make sure that your fourth video clip here, that assessment piece, connects to the evidence that you're collecting. And certainly the higher order thinking skills can happen by students collaborating, students constructing a product of learning, like my equivalent ratio poster. Maybe it is a game that you've created. I love games, by the way. I just created a fun game called Integer Race to Zero, and it could be used as assessment measure. Students could be playing the game. They're using higher order thinking skills in a game because they have to decide what they will do with the products when they're multiplying integers, if they're going to add or subtract. And so any type of games typically elicit higher order thinking skills. You will be providing samples of those informal and student self-assessments like we talked about in your plan. And this time your submission here will be samples of students' work. Okay, so step one, we had to provide a blank copy of that formal assessment. Step two here, we're actually including informal and student self-assessments. Okay. And then your written narrative, which will be your analysis of that evidence that you've collected. And finally, in here in step three, not finally just yet, you're going to reflect on your evidence. So, in this part of CAL TPA Cycle 2, you're going to score your formal assessment for the whole class. You're going to select 3 examples of student responses. Now, here you see here products, processes, or performances. So it's pretty open-ended. You don't have to necessarily submit um, all of the evidence that you've collected from the different types of assessments. You just need to select one type of assessment measure. And as you can see, you'll score those formal assessments from 3 students that represents evidence of learning with detailed content, specific rubric, and or your scoring criteria feedback to the 3 students. So score those rubrics, put your comments on there, and submit that as your evidence. And then your analysis will include that written narrative. You are going to look at all that data, both from the 360-foot level of how did my entire class do, and then you look at those individuals. Now remember, your individual is very intentional here. It says 3 examples. One of those examples should be from a student that exceeds the learning goal. One should be a student that meets the learning goal. And the third example should be does not yet meet the learning goal. So it doesn't have to be your 3 focus students. It has to be 3 examples that represent the range of students' performance. Okay. And then you're going to apply the evidence. You've analyzed your evidence, you've looked at those student samples. Now you're going to plan and conduct a follow-up instructional activity based on your analysis. It could either be a reteaching activity. So maybe I've taught adding and subtracting integers using integer chips. Now I want to show it on a number line. Or it can be an extension activity. My students have mostly demonstrated mastery. So I'm going to move on and I'm going to extend their learning from adding and subtracting integers to multiplying and dividing. I will need to describe how I decided on the instructional approach. Again, analyze your data, see where the range of students lie. Typically, like rule of thumb, if the majority of your students are struggling with a particular skill, you're going to reteach. But if the majority of students have demonstrated mastery, you'll do an extension activity. Your reteaching or extension activity should be a total of 3 pages describing that, how that change was informed by your analysis. And then you're going to do an additional annotated video clip or of the follow-up instruction. So get ready to show yourself teaching again. Okay, educators, so hopefully this video has shared some insight. You definitely want to check out those rubrics. There are rubrics for each of those steps. Step 1 has 2 rubrics that focus on the learning goals and assessments. It also has rubric 2.2 that focuses on the planning of your learning segments and assessment and strategies. And then step 2 has a total of 5 rubrics. And that's where you're doing all of that teaching. Step 3 includes your 1 rubric for reflecting and example of students' work. Okay. Well, I hope you found this really insightful. Again, once you've collected all your evidence, You want to analyze your students' performance. You can look at student work samples here. I like print. I like to have print examples so I can look at it and say, based on what I'm seeing in what my students are able to do, this was a game that they played on multiplying integers. I could see that my students in this follow-up reteaching was able to demonstrate mastery. They just needed some additional practice to put the skill into the level of mastery. So I'm glad I retaught that. All right. So I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to leave a comment, a like, and let me know what else you'd like to see.